The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was created in Congress to allow Missouri's inclusion into the Union as a slave state and Maine as a free state. It was signed on March 6, 1820 by President James Monroe. Within the compromise, legislators limited the expansion of slavery west and north of Missouri and the 3630 line on its southern border, excluding the state of Missouri itself. The legislators intended for the compromise to keep the number of slave and free states equal as the Union expanded westward. After the War of 1812, the Louisiana Territory's population surged, especially in the area that would become the Missouri Territory in 1816, and then in 1817, the territory petitioned for statehood. Congress had been debating the Union's westward expansion, and many had plans for how they could prevent the expansion of slavery. In 1818, New York's 4th Congressional District Representative, James Talmadge, proposed adding a stipulation to Missouri's admission bill. He suggested that the state should ban the import of any new slaves and that any child born to a slave after Missouri's admittance to the Union become free once they reached the age of 25. When put to a vote in the House of Representatives, it was shot down when even some Northern representatives voted against it. Eventually, the first attempt to make Missouri a state died, but would come back a couple of years later. Later in 1819, due to Missouri's previous attempt at statehood and its dramatic population increase, other areas in the Missouri Territory petitioned to become separate territories. When Arkansas petitioned to become a territory in 1819, the issue that James Talmadge had brought up in 1818 came back in full force. But this time, the Saratoga County Representative, John W. Taylor, made the proposal. He proposed that no new slaves could be introduced to the territory, and children born of slaves would be free, but they would be held in servitude until they reached 25 years of age. He was not alone in his efforts, as many Northern representatives were trying to stop the westward expansion of slavery. However, his attempts would fail after Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, and many other representatives voiced their disapproval and the unconstitutionality of the proposition. Many claimed that Taylor's proposal violated the Louisiana Cession Treaty. The treaty, made by France, guaranteed the property rights of all the territory's inhabitants forever. Slaves were considered property at the time, so the treaty applied to them as well. Popular sovereignty was another issue that representatives had with Taylor's amendment. Felix Walker claimed it would deprive Southerners of any advantages they could gain from the Louisiana Territory. The Constitution did not give Congress the power to prohibit the transportation of property into territories. They believed it was the residents' right to decide on the issue of slavery. Henry Shaw was one of the 15 Northerners who vetoed the amendment, and one of the 10 legislators who had also voted down Talmadge's amendment. He explained that Congress had no right to limit a state's sovereignty, that this interpretation of the Constitution opened it to questioning, and that he saw it as a principle dangerous to the peace, the liberties, and union of the country. Arkansas became a territory without any restrictions, but John Taylor would try again during Missouri's second attempt at statehood. This time, his amendment allowed for slaves to be reclaimed if they escaped. It passed to the Senate, where they deleted his amendment, but added the boundaries we now know. This passed in the House and Senate, then to the President to sign. To maintain the balance between slave and free states, Maine was admitted to the Union at the same time as Missouri as the 23rd and 24th states respectively. The committee report from the Missouri Compromise, which was agreed upon by both the House and Senate, is a summary of the discussions and debates on Missouri's admission. The document includes the basics of making a territory a state, like describing state boundaries, citizens' rights, voting rights of white males over 21, and land use dictations. At the very end of the document is where they mention the boundaries of slavery expansion. They also mention that any slave who escapes can be captured and returned to their owner. The primary document interacts with the topic of the Missouri Compromise of 1820 because the document outlines the main point of the compromise, which was the limitation of slavery's expansion west of the Mississippi River and north of the 3630 line. This limitation was intended to help the cause for abolition by preventing the overexpansion of slave states, and it worked as intended. But we could argue that it hurt the cause of abolition by keeping the balance between slave and free states, allowing them to expand instead of addressing it immediately. The debates surrounding the allowance and limitations of slavery were brought to the public, showing how significant the issue was becoming within the government. The media was filled with debates, and many wondered if the constitutional framers had intended for slavery to expand or to burn out over time. Congress could not limit slave trading before 1808, but they were hoping that they could open the door to limiting it. Over time, more states were added to the Union as slave states, like Arkansas in 1836, Texas and Florida in 1845, and the states that would come from the Mexican Cession. While there were other states added to the Union as free states to maintain the balance between slave states and free states, such as Michigan, Iowa, and Wisconsin. The new territory gained from the Mexican Cession was predicted to produce new slave states due to the current slavery establishment in the territory. However, before the Civil War started, the states produced like California in 1850 and Oregon in 1859 were free states. Abolitionists were becoming infuriated with how slavery was expanding. Tensions between Northerners and Southerners were escalating, and discontent and rebellions from white and black people alike were constantly rising. Many believed that more slave states being added proved that the government had a pro-slavery agenda. When President Monroe had initially signed the Missouri Compromise, he had great hopes that it would keep the Union together and that it would help the government reach the highest level of perfection that humans could. He was ultimately proven wrong as the country entered a civil war. The Missouri Compromise held on for 34 years until it was repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 and later declared unconstitutional by the Dred Scott v. Sandford decision in 1857. The rising tensions between slave and free states, as well as Southerners and Northerners, eventually led to the Civil War, although the Missouri Compromise was able to hold the country at bay for a while.